I'm Hannah Joy with The Nocturnal, and I'm so honored to be conducting this interview so we can talk a little bit about the Amazon series that's coming out, Dom. And it's super exciting. We have Gabriel Falivo, and we have Breno. Is that correct? Is that right?
Correto. Yeah, that's it. É isso.
Yes, correct.
Great. So I want us first to talk about a little bit about the series, what's been going on. Tell us about your characters and what's that been like. Starring as Pedro and Victor. Tell us a little bit about it.
Ah, bom, a
Well,
série apareceu para mim através de
the
um
show
convite do Breno. O Breno sempre foi um
came into
diretor
my
que eu
life
admirei, que eu
through
tinha
Breno's
prazer de trabalhar.
invitation. I had always admired
E ele
Breno.
me
I wanted to
apresentou
work with
essa
him, and he
série com uma temática até um pouco
introduced this
atemporal que
show
não tinha
to
no
me.
Brasil, mas que a ideia dele era dar
It has kind of
uma
a
visão
recurring
diferente. E isso me
topic,
interessou
but
muito desde o
it's
início,
told from a different point
principalmente
of view, and that
por uma
really
série
interested
ser
me
baseada
from
em
the
fatos
beginning.
reais,
I like
de
that the
forma
show was based
melhor do que isso.
on real life, and he'll tell you more about that better than I
E o que
can.
me atraiu pro
And
personagem
what
era a
called my
possibilidade
attention
de
about the
Dom
character
ser
was because Pedro
um
Dome
bandido
was
famoso na
a
instituição de justiça aqui
famous
no Rio de Janeiro.
criminal here in Rio de
Só que a
Janeiro,
informação a respeito dele é
but the
muito
information
rasa,
that we have
muito
about him is very
superficial
superficial,
e às vezes até
and
informações
sometimes
deturpadas.
um,
Então me
they're
interessou a
not told.
temática da série,
They're a
especialmente
bit distorted, let's
na
say. So
sobrevivência
what
química,
what called my attention
de
was
trazer lado mais humano para essa
showing a
história,
more human
não ser
aspect
relatada só sob o ponto de vista
to the story, which
do
was
lado
told
criminoso dele. Então
from
é
more
personagem
criminal
que
perspective usually.
viveu esse lado obscuro da
This
dependência
is a
química,
person who
mas por outro
did
lado
live in crime, who was a drug addict, but on the other
através
hand,
dos relatos do próprio pai dele, né, através do que chegou até mim
I
através do Breno,
know about
que ele sempre
him
foi um
through
menino
Breno and through his
carismático,
father, and he was
cativante,
always a charismatic person from what they
luminoso.
say, someone
Então
who was
esse
very
personagem
enlightened
complexo dessa
or
maneira
full of
foi muito
light.
atrativo para
So
mim.
that
E ao
complex
longo
character
das
really
filmagens
called my attention, and
conheci
throughout
pessoas por onde a gente passou,
the filming process, I
as
met a lot of
locações reais
people
que ele passou, tiveram contato com
when
ele e vinham me
a lot of
dar
people that actually met
informações,
him
feedback,
and
que
people
só
that gave
deu
me
respaldo
feedback
ao
that
caminho que
just
ele escolheu
supported
para
the
personagem.
path that we were
Desses dois
on
lados, né? Pessoas que
with
tiveram
this character.
experiências
I talked to people who had
ótimas com ele,
great
que
experiences
falavam
with
dele com
him,
saudade, com
people
alegria,
that
e
miss
pessoas que
him,
tiveram
people
experiências
that talked
traumáticas,
about him
experiências terríveis com ele.
in a great way, and then
Então
other people that
esse
had
tipo de
terrible
coisa que me atrai
experiences with
quando eu
him.
faço
And that's
filme,
what
quando
really
personagens
attracts
são
me in these types of
complexos
shows,
e
complex characters
enfim,
that
permitem que eu consiga ter
allow me
trabalho mais
to be able
menos
to
superficial,
have
pelo contrário,
a
um
less
trabalho de
superficial
conhecimento
type of work.
de
I have to
sutilezas.
actually
Eu
dive
acho que
in
essa
and
maneira
take a look at all the
história se conecta
subtleties, and I think
melhor
that that's how we connect better with the audience.
Ana, falar do Vitor um pouco. O
Well, I'm going to
Vitor,
talk about
que foi
Victor.
quem relatou essa história pro Breno,
Victor
e daí
told
partiu
Breno
todo
this
esse
story, and
contato
that's
de
where
contar essa
everything
história e
came
a
from, the
vontade que o Breno
desire to tell
sempre
this story and the
junto
desire
lá no
that
Breno
Breno
para contar
made
várias
very
razões,
clear
e aí
that he
acho que o
wanted to
Gabriel já
tell the
falou
story for
bastante
several
disso,
reasons, and I think Gabriel already
mas
talked
ele
about that,
mostre
but
a origem de todo
I
esse
think that
conflito,
even
que
though it
é
shows the origin of the
a saída da
conflict, which
droga,
is drug
o
trafficking
crime,
and
na verdade
crime,
o que fundamenta
what actually
essa trama é a relação
is
desse
the
pai e
core
desse
of all of
filho.
this is the relationship
E aí
between
falando um
father and
pouco do
son.
Victor, é um cara que
Victor is this
um tempo
guy
atrás, quando
who,
era jovem, ele
when
era
he was
mergulhador,
young,
e
he
aí por
was a
acaso
diver,
o destino
and
ele teve
because
contato com
of
serviço
a
secreto e entrou para a
coincidence, he
polícia
got into the
com o
police
intuito
force
de ter uma
to
ação de entrar na guerra contra as drogas, a cocaína que
declare
começava a
war
entrar
against drugs
no
because cocaine
Brasil
was starting to come into
naquela
Brazil
época, na
in
década de
that time
60.
in the 70s.
Então ele levou grande
And
parte da
so
vida
he
lutando
spent a
contra a
lot of
droga,
his
sempre
life
frente
fighting against drugs. He
lutava
was
contra a
a
droga.
police
E aí
agent
o
that fought
dilema
against
maior
drugs, and
dessa
his
relação e dessa série é justamente que o filho dele
the big dilemma is that his son became a drug addict. He came into contact with drugs very early on, and he also became a criminal due to the drugs. So this guy who had fought against crime and drugs saw crime come into his house, and he lost his child to that world. So I think that that's what Victor is. He's this guy that does anything to try to rescue his child. Well, Dome to me is a fantastic story. It's absolutely incredible. It's unique. It's uncommon to come in contact with stories like this. Victor told me this story 12 years ago. He had lost his child, and then I discovered that he was in the police force. He fought against drugs, and his son, in that moment in Rio de Janeiro, he was the biggest, let's say, burglar in Rio de Janeiro. So these are two very different worlds. There are a lot of stories about drug trafficking nowadays. There are a lot of stories that talk about drugs, but I had the chance to actually see something different in the story. I got a testimony of someone who saw how the city changed and how his own household changed. His relationship with his kid was based on trying to get him out of drugs. And it's interesting to see these testimonies because they're tragic. In the end, it's a tragedy that we know is going to happen. We know that Pedro died. We know this because of the Brazilian media. So we start understanding all of the processes that lead to that, and we start understanding this story that is much more complicated than just a drug trafficking story. This is a story that talks about something within, from this loss and an impossible mission that Victor had, which was to try to save the country and his child from drugs, and he wasn't able to do so. And that's very relevant to me. And we also understood that it's not so easy to get out of drugs. There were so many attempts. They put Pedro into rehabilitation centers, but he always went back to drugs, and that led to his death. And, well, these two characters have a lot of conflicts, and that's extremely interesting to me. It's hard to find such a relevant story with such interesting characters, and that's what made me want to tell the story.
So I want us to focus on the father and son relationship, because I thought that was just so important, and it was very dynamic, and you said it brought some conflicts. But in this series, for Victor, what was it like to watch your son succumb to cocaine? And then what would you really say about addiction and how addiction can control a person's livelihood?
Do you want to say something, Breno? No, it's all yours. Well, I think that's the greatest pain. It isn't just that, someone becomes a drug addict in a family. No, this is a father who always fought against drugs and saw this as a huge social issue back then, and it became what it is today. The story wasn't so long ago. It was 20 years ago approximately. And so it's very intense. And how do we solve this? There are so many paths, and there's no right path. There's no rule to this. I think the show tries to portray that affection between both of them, that need. They never gave up on each other. The father never gave up on the son, and the son never gave up on the father, even though they were in completely different places and completely different worlds. And what interferes in the family's life is huge. It's hard to measure. And it doesn't only determine the life of the person who has this addiction, but everyone around this person, everyone that loves that person. If you think about just drug addiction, in Pedro's case, it took him into a criminal life. It wasn't just a physiological, physical thing, psychological thing. It took him down another path, and it was worse, and it was irreversible, because there's also something about necessity, adrenaline rush, and he had this. He needed that adrenaline rush. He needed to live intensely. Both of them needed this, but they both went about it differently. Yeah, there's something that I always like to highlight regarding what Flavio said about that basis of the show, which is the relationship between father and son, the love between father and son, and the fact that they never gave up on each other. And that's a reality that happened until Pedro's last days. They always found a way to meet. And that was a challenge for us, because the script had a lot. I mean, most of the scenes with both of us were about fights, and a lot of time physical fights. So something that we established as key was to not allow that to be a trap. We didn't want the scenes to just be about confrontation, about two enemies. No, quite the contrary. Every confrontation, every fight, even when they fought physically, all of that came from love, came from that intense, strong love that sometimes the way they dealt with it was just got out of hand. So to us, it was essential that we would connect to that. Even if we were going to fight, we had to remember that we had to connect to that, and we would stimulate that love. And Breno, in the scenes, he would help us put in those subtleties. That way, when the audience watches it, they don't just see that fighting and that confrontation. I mean, they fight, but they're not enemies. They're opposing sides that are trying to find each other and trying to find this middle way or middle ground. And it was impossible, unfortunately. But the affection, the love between both of them never ceased to exist.
And I think that's important, that when you both talked about the love that they shared, and that's important, especially in any family unit, that you keep the love. You keep the love despite the difficulty, despite all the obstacles, the trials and tribulations. We have to keep the love, because you do not want to see the other person fail or stumble. You know, you want to help them get back on their feet. And so I think that's really what family is all about. And so what do you all think caused, even in today's society, caused the disconnect between the old generation and the young in fathers and sons? What do you guys think? Just in today's generation, I know that many father and son relationships, just as it is mothers and daughters, they struggle and they bump heads sometimes. Why do you guys think that is?
I think it's natural in every generation or between generations. The difference is just in how we face it. In Dom's case, his childhood was marvelous. He was a middle-class boy. He had everything he needed to shine. He had a family close to him. The conflict begins with his father's absence, I think, because his father was on those missions to try to save the city. He says something that is his... He says that he spent so many times trying to save other people from drugs and that he forgot about his own son. And that says a lot about the show, and that says a lot about Pedro and who he became, because in a way he was an absent father in a moment of Pedro's life that was very important. And when Pedro got into drugs, Victor wasn't there, he wasn't around. And we know that, yes, drugs can impact people differently. I mean, maybe one person tries drugs and then never again, and then other people that become addicted. In Pedro's case, he became very addicted. The first time he was in a rehab center, he was 13, and he was in rehab centers 15 times. Imagine putting your kid in a rehab center when he's on cocaine at age 13. So that conflict in this family is very clear. You can see when the drug enters that household. Before drugs, I don't think they had a clear conflict, but I think drugs really did something to Pedro. And the lack of Victor's presence in that moment is what caused this rupture between them and a conflict. And we know that generational conflict is even healthy. We all want to be free from our parents, but in this case, I think drugs really changed their relationship forever, and that lasted forever until Pedro died.
Desculpa.
Sorry, Hannah. I just wanted to add something. Flavio always says something interesting. I wanted him to say it later, and it has to do with what Breno just said regarding the absence. Sometimes, I mean, there were so many rehab centers, and sometimes you watch it and you think, oh, it's obvious it's not going to work. But when you put yourself in that father's position, you understand that you might not agree, but you understand that he was trying to do whatever he could just to help his kid, his son. So when the drug addiction starts, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to try to solve it. It is possible. There are treatments. There are people that do get out of it, but it's very difficult. And unfortunately, in their case, the story did not have a happy ending. Yes, what I say in the show is it takes us an entire life to know if we did things right or did things wrong, if we got it right or if we got it wrong. And yes, he was absent. He had a daughter as well, and that didn't impact his daughter's path. Why? Because it's impossible to foresee what's going to happen, and we only know what happens when we look back.
And I think you all made valid points. And so for Breno, I have to ask you, by being a Brazilian film director, how important is it to bring diversity and inclusion to the set?
Very, very important. There's something beautiful in the show. I think that the most beautiful characters came from the favela. Pedro's best friend, Lico, you start to understand there that Rio de Janeiro, differently from other cities in the world, allows this. Rio allows this mix. Even though there is prejudice, in Rio, since the favelas are in wealthy neighborhoods, they're present. So at the beach, you see this mixture, and all of us who live in Rio have this mix in a different way, in some way. And I think that the show reflects what Rio is. You see the characters have different colors, races, and that's what Rio is, and that's what the show tries to reflect and try to portray, that capacity that Rio has to gather all these different people. And what I think is great about Dome is that this show can communicate with the world. It was amazing today because I spoke to people from India, people from Colombia, people from the United States, and I think that in a way, streaming and these shows that are launched globally, they bring us closer together. They help us understand what we have in common. And I hope that these shows can bridge us, and so we can have less distance between religions and people and cultures. And it's important for us to see other cultures and other people's stories. That way we understand that we're all living in the same world and we're all the same, we're all equal. I just wanted to add something to that. Something that I find very interesting in our show is that Pedro, he's somebody that represented the opposite of the stereotype of a criminal. That stereotype comes from our structural racism, and that shows this absurdity that we live. And Pedro was a middle, high-class criminal. He had opportunities, and he was very well known because of his appearance. They called him the little rich criminal, and he used that prejudice that society had to be able to get into places and rob places. So that's another part of the show that I think makes people think about all of that, how this breaks with a stereotype. And that actually happened in real life, that would come out in newspapers. So that's also an interesting reflection that the show provokes.
Well, Hannah, we have to wrap for now.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you. I really appreciate this interview.
It was great.
Thank you. I hope you have a great day.
You too. Bye.
It was nice meeting you guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, Hannah.